have they signed in?
Yep.
Because we've not got high numbers, so we don't miss anybody that's here.
No. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this month's lunchtime lecture on the last Friday of the month. Before we start, I'd just like to go through the basics. We don't have any fire alarm scheduled today, so if one does go off, it's going to be real. The exits are down the stairs. Don't use the lifts. If you have a mobility issue, if you just wait, there are lots of fire wardens that know how to help and get you out of the building. And then if everybody can assemble underneath Waterloo Bridge, which is just off to the east that way, we can count you and make sure that there are no bodies that we need to come and find afterwards. So I think that's it. This is the Faraday Centre. It doesn't work very well as a Faraday cage, so please turn your phones off or put them on silent. And we are filming this afternoon, so if you don't want to be filmed, please go and hide in a corner and don't ask any questions. So with that, I'm Nick Hunn. I'm really privileged to be asked to talk to you today. I think as a teenager, I taught myself electronics by building various audio amplifiers and other stuff that probably various others of you in this room have done. And I've been fortunate to work in the audio industry in a number of different aspects over the years. It's intrigued me that it's an industry that is absolutely full of basically lies, that there is so much when you delve back into history and you ask 3 or 4 people, they all have totally different views of what actually happened. So what I've been trying to do is pull together what I think is the true story of how we got from the start to where we are today. But some of it may be totally apocryphal or wrong. But it's a fascinating story. One question I have for our wonderful AV people here, is there a clicker for the slides? Ah, I see it. Oh my God, I meant to give it to him 10 minutes ago. Movement from the back. So what I want to do today on this is watch technicians run around. This is the story of audio if you're ever out in the community. Look at where we've got to with audio, where it started, and why sound has actually been so very, very difficult. It's a fascinating history. We think it's all about music, it's all about notes. It is all about notes, but it tends to be about the notes that you see on the side of the screen. It's an industry that's been driven by revenue and different parts of that industry trying to ensure that they can capture most of the revenue and to control the speed of development of it. So if we look at where we've gone, it's odd when you think about it and you think, but we've been able to do pictures for millennia. We did cave drawings, all of these tens of thousands of years ago. We worked out how to do writing a long time ago, about 5,000 years. And it's interesting, I mean, music has been with us all the time. Cuneiform even had a notation that you could actually start to write music, getting on for 1,000 years BC. It took another 2,000 to get where we are today. I mean, the notation we have today of the musical stave is about 800 AD. But that was still only a way of telling people how to copy something and do it. It wasn't a way of actually playing a sound. And you sort of come to the question of, why has it taken us that long? And particularly when you look at video. For a long time, we've known that if you flip pictures, and we all used to play with these little flip books when we were kids, and you flip them round and you can see the sails on the windmill go round. Those were even patented some time back, and I love the name of the sort of the pocket cinema that was used way back in the 1860s when these were done. And we have devices like the zoetrope, the little things going round where you see motion. Motion works, but one of the interesting things is motion only works because with sight we have something called retinal persistence. The eye remembers something and then the brain sort of fills in, and you only need to flip something about 24 times a second in order to be able to think it's flicker free, it's just proper video. It's amazing how we do that. And you think, but there's all that information. Sound doesn't have that much information. It should be much, much easier. But surprisingly, it's not. If you look at sound, and we all recognize this picture, and what's fascinating is that sort of image of what a sound wave looks like is something we've only known about for about 50, 60 years. Interesting sound. And you think, well, why can't you do the same thing that we did with video? Why can't you just sample this every sort of 24 times a second? So if I just chop this wave up into 24 times and play it back, what does it sound like? So if we try doing that, 24 hertz. Hertz is the symbol that's used for frequency. It's the number of cycles a second, the number of times you repeat it, named after a German physicist called Heinrich Hertz. So if I cut that waveform up and play it at 24 times a second, none of you can hear it. We have just played that, but it comes out below human hearing. If I take it and cut it up, do it 10 times as fast, so 240 times a second, I'm sampling that waveform and playing it back. Is that clear? Take it up another 10 times. We're now 100 times faster than we can actually look at what we do with video.
What I'm saying.
Getting closer? If I take it up and sample it 24,000 times a second, then we suddenly see...
Can you understand what I'm saying?
We really need to sample sound incredibly quickly. I mean, this is 2,400 times a second. And effectively with the ear, that sound coming in gets pushed straight up to the brain, and the brain does all of the work. Unlike vision, where the eye is doing quite a lot of work for us. Now, the good news on that is with sound, it means we can do cochlear implants, where we're just stimulating nerves and the brain does the work. We're still a long way away from being able to do that with vision. But it means it's a totally different problem for everybody who has been trying to say, how do I reproduce sound? I was going to say at the beginning, I should have talked about the trigger warnings. The trigger warning for this, it does include some physics. But I've tried to lull you into a sort of state of something or other so you don't notice it too much. Frequency response is how far we can hear. Now, as human beings, as babies, we're quite good. Babies can hear up to about 20 kilohertz. As we become engineers and play around with power tools, that goes down a bit. Most of us in here are probably going to be pushing 14 kilohertz. Our bass response gets a bit better, but that's mainly because our ears get bigger, so they're better at coping with longer wavelengths. And other animals do a lot better than we do. Dogs, we think, do brilliantly. They don't do as well as ferrets. Ferrets are really good. And cats are even better. Interesting one with cats is we think of cats as not necessarily having very squeaky voices. We think of mice having very squeaky voices, and they do, but cats have better hearing than mice. So when the mice are thinking, ha, that cat can't hear me, it can. And things like bats and porpoises are absolutely brilliant. But as far as we're concerned, we've got quite a limited range. We can go from about 50 hertz up to about 14, 15 kilohertz by the time you've sort of got up into your 20s. One of the things that sort of is interesting, and here is where I'm afraid the physics comes in, two very great engineers in the last century that were looking at how we did this, basically looked at how much information you can put into a stream and said that the maximum frequency that you can encode is about half the number of samples that you do. This comes from the work of Claude Shannon and Harry Nyquist. And Harry Nyquist was the one that came up with a very simple formula to say that the highest frequency you're likely to get out in terms of your bandwidth is half your sampling rate. And on the previous samples we saw, once we got up to 24 kilohertz, that means a frequency response of about 12 kilohertz, so you could hear my voice properly with that. But we need to push it up to those really high frequencies if we're going to do that. So the very first recording that was ever made was made by a Frenchman back in the 1860s, Edward Leon Scott de Martinville. He made a device to try and capture the look of sound, basically those sound waves we were looking at. He started off, and it's fascinating if you read his notes, he wanted to get a little horn to amplify the sound, and then connected that to a quill of a feather that was effectively writing on a piece of paper that had been blacked with soot. If you look at this, it's a reconstruction of his apparatus. If you turned the handle, that drum, which had the coated paper on, went round and round. But because it's on a screw thread that you can see at the end, it also pushed it along a bit. So by doing that, he was able to capture the first sounds. His notes are fascinating. In order to get a horn, whereas most people have gone out and bought an ear trumpet, he claims he used the ears of decapitated dogs. I didn't know there was a trade in Paris for decapitated dogs, but presumably there was. And what he came up with was a trace like this. And that is basically shows the way that that little single quill off the feather was making the trace on the carbon soot paper. Now, he never thought that what he'd recorded would be replayed, at least in his lifetime. He left all of these recordings to the National Archive in France, and they basically languished there for over a century. In 2008, they were rediscovered, and a group in the US took this and wondered whether they could take that, magnify it, and actually listen to it as a sound wave. And they did that, and what they discovered was it was the sound of a young woman, well, may not have been young, a woman singing Au clair de la lune. Except it wasn't. I mean, it almost was, but they then looked at some of the other traces, and they discovered that Scott Martinville had done something really clever. As well as recording the human voice, he'd also recorded a tuning fork. And that acted as a reference so they could see just how fast the paper had been moving. And when they corrected for that, they discovered that it was apparently Scott Martinville himself singing Au clair de la lune. And this is what it sounds like. A voice from 1860, the first human voice that we know that was ever recorded. A couple of fascinating bits that sort of go around that, which predate what the industry has done, is if I hadn't told you that was Au clair de la lune beforehand, I don't think anybody would have the faintest idea. And the audio industry has realized this is a really good trick. If you tell somebody how good the audio quality is, the audience tends to believe them. And we'll see that a few times as we carry on through our history of where audio has gone. Most of the time, if you do any subjective listening tests, you'll discover that the listener response is not necessarily what the marketing of the various audio companies want you to expect to hear. So going on, not much work was done on this. Scott Martinville's stuff was put aside, it was largely forgotten, and then we had some other people coming along the tail end of last century, the beginning of this century, who were starting to do something a little more clever. In France, we had the work that was being done with the Phonodiec by Muller. He basically took the same sort of approach. He had big drums of film that he rotated very quickly, and through a lot of this went very quickly in these days as you're looking at rolls of film where you're passing film past in front of you at about 5 foot per second. So massive amount of film going past. But he used a tiny mirror connected to a galvanometer that was deflected by the electric force of the microphone. And he recorded in far more detail, and you'll see at the top of this, what a sound wave looked like. Wasn't particularly practical. At the bottom is his experimental apparatus. It took up a room, it consumed film at about 5 feet per minute, and he had absolutely no way of playing any of that back. And we saw more developments. Philips Laboratories over in the Netherlands were doing a lot of audio work, even back in the 1910, 1920s. They invented some really fast paper needle recorders that could start to record this. But it wasn't until after the Second World War when we had storage oscilloscopes. They're the devices you'll see in every film you've ever watched with a science background in it. And there you can actually display this in real time. But for most of our parents certainly, they probably never saw a sound wave until we got through to the 1960s. It's something we all know, we all recognise, but it's happened remarkably recently. But we were getting there, we knew what sound waves looked like. We'd actually knew quite a lot about sound beforehand because people had done experiments. You may remember from school something that was called a Chladni plate. It was basically just a metal plate and you sprinkled sand on top of it. And if you ran a bow down the side from a violin, you would see patterns start to form in it. We were beginning to understand the concepts of frequency, of nodes, and how it happens. We knew that you needed air in order to produce a sound wave. The famous experiment that Robert Boyle was the one that basically got right, of putting a ringing bell inside a vacuum jar and then pumping the air out and discovering that you could no longer hear the sound. And everybody concluded from that you needed air in order to transmit the sound. That was actually a wrong conclusion. The vacuum that he achieved was nothing like enough to actually stop sound. But as you reduce the number of air molecules, the number of molecules to pick up the vibration of the bell goes down, and at the same side, the number of molecules to vibrate the bell jar goes down. So what he actually showed was an experiment that you needed a high impedance match between the air and what's making the sound. He hadn't quite got to the point that nobody can hear you scream in space. But we knew that air affected it. We knew that different liquids affected it. People were playing around with helium. Mr. Faraday was playing around with hydrogen in balloons back in 1824. And I would like to think that he or some of his lab assistants did try taking in a breath to see what happened. And hopefully they weren't smoking at the time. So we knew these things. We knew that sound travelled slower than light just by watching distant explosions and the fact you can see it before you can hear it. So the physics was getting there. But what we really needed was to create a market. And there's a very interesting connection here with somebody that you would think had nothing to do with music, which is Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, having cut off a king's head, basically closed all of the licentious theatres, appeared to do his best to stop music. Music at that point, throughout the whole of Europe, was largely something that was done through patronage. It was kings, it was aristocrats, nobles, that had the money to pay composers, to pay their own bands of musicians, and basically perform music when they wanted to for their benefit and their friends' benefit. Now, when Cromwell closed all of the theatres, he put the whole of the UK music business out of work. And musicians went out, many of them moved to the continent. When he finally moved, they came back again, and a few of them started to look for interesting new jobs. Now, while Cromwell was in power, there were also another few interesting things that went on. John Davenport, who had sort of proclaimed himself as the next Shakespeare, came along and persuaded Cromwell that opera didn't fit in with licentious music. Opera was proper and it was pure and it ought to be allowed. And he even persuaded Cromwell to commission him to write an opera that potentially was going to be used at the marriage of one of Cromwell's daughters. And Cromwell thought this should be public because it's good for you. And we see that attitude all of the way through the development of the music industry, that although opera sold virtually nothing in terms of volume of recordings, it was the one thing that was always held up to aspire to in terms of any new technology. So looking at that, what happened after that was a particular violinist who, at the end of Cromwell's reign as Lord Protector, decided he wanted to see if there were other ways of making money, decided to start doing public concerts. and public concerts were unknown at this point. It was a violinist called John Bannister, and he initially set up afternoon concerts in his house in Whitefriars. After a year, they were so successful, he moved out. He set up a subscription series. You would pay. There were concerts every afternoon. You were guaranteed a new work every Monday. And people flocked to them. It was the first time that you could pay to listen to music. Within a few years, every town within England that thought it had any sort of culture had set up a concert hall. And we started this whole concept of the general public paying to listen to music. It spread throughout Europe, and it made a major change because now composers and virtuosos could go and basically work for whoever gave them the most money. In the 1760s, we had the sort of prepubescent Mozart being toured around Europe as a child prodigy. And 100 years later, we had people like Liszt who became celebrities in their own right. Now, a quick warning here, please don't throw your underwear at me. It's really difficult to explain when I get home. But if you think that's new, all of the excesses we associate with rock stars was there when Liszt was around. He scandalized Europe, not least because people didn't expect a German to behave like that. It was an absolutely licentious time. Ken Russell captured it really well in his film Listomania, which incidentally had Ringo Starr playing the role of the Pope. So if the Vatican feels it needs any additional candidates, he's probably about the right age for it. That changed the whole way that music was promoted and that musicians got paid. And that then brought in the next one of how did they ensure that they were the ones that got paid for doing this rather than somebody that ripped it off. And the whole of the history of music since that point has been riddled with copyright and copyright lawyers. Copyright came in the UK. We led in this, I think it was 1708 with the Statute of Anne. That was to try and promote better numbers of books being sold. It actually did exactly the opposite because it licensed a limited number of publishers who hiked the prices up when there wasn't any competition. 30 years later, Walpole and Hogarth basically did a deal to extend that to printed pictures in exchange for censorship of the stage. And we then had various other extensions of this which covered printed music, and eventually we got to the Berne Convention, which I think was in the 1890s. The US took it all very differently. They didn't accept much of this. They really were appalling at stealing copyright, particularly on music. And they didn't adopt the Berne Convention until 100 years after virtually everybody else. It was in the late 1980s that they finally did that. Most of the time, the recording companies and Walt Disney were driving copyright in the US, largely because Disney didn't want porn variants of Mickey Mouse. But it has been a really big business for lawyers. However, back to how do we reproduce sound? Everybody thinks that Edison, and not Scott Martinville, was the creator of sound, with the first instrument that Edison produced in the 1878. We've all probably seen versions of this. It's not that different from what Martinville did. He, again, used some tin plate. He ran it round under a needle. There was a little diaphragm on this that you could talk into, and that caused the needle to scratch holes or scratch tracks within the tin foil. And if you then changed the diaphragm to a small stylus and you played it round again, it would reproduce the sound. Now this and everything for the next 50 years is purely mechanical. And it sort of worked. The tin foil didn't last very long. You could only play it a few times. It was quite a hefty instrument. It weighed about 10 kilos, and it also only had a recording capacity of about 60 words. But it proved the point. Over the next 10 years, he improved it, but at the same time, a number of other people were also simultaneously inventing ways to do it. The most important one, Emil Berliner, a German, decided that you'd use a flat disc, like the records we know today. We had Poulsen, Voldemar Poulsen over in Holland, developed a device that was the first magnetic recorder. And also, I think a fascinating one which we need to add into this story is the player piano. Because that, again, was a market where you could buy piano rolls, people could make them, ship them, and you could put them on a device and reproduce sound. And that came out from Edwin Votey around about 1886. A little bit about the difference between what Edison did and what Emil Berliner did. Edison had a needle that went up and down, so it basically dug grooves into the soft wax of the recording. As you were moving the cylinder along, it didn't need anything to steer it, but the issue was that every time you played it, it tended to dig down into that recording. And after 10 recordings, you'd basically wiped out what you'd got. Berliner's, on the other hand, waved the needle side to side. So when you played the record, your needle waved side to side, and it picked up that sound. It didn't wear out anything like as much, but you needed a special machine to record the record in the first place that was slowly moving that needle across so that you got the spiral groove in the record. And that meant, from Berliner's point of view, an average user couldn't record with this. You could only play a pre-recorded disc, but the pre-recorded discs were a lot cheaper to make than Edison's ones, because you can just stamp a record and they'll all be the same. With a cylinder, it's really difficult to make a mold of a cylinder without having a groove down either side of it, which would produce a click every time you get round to it. If we look at what happened with tape recorders, tape at this time, we didn't have tape. Recordings were made on wire, just a standard piece of steel wire which can be magnetized. And it's a very simple technique. You put an electromagnet around the wire. When you record, you feed the audio into that electromagnet and it magnetizes the wire. And when you want to play back, then that same electromagnet will pick up the magnetic field and convert that to an electrical impulse. The original ones that Oboler and Smith patented, he never managed to get to work very well, but Valdemar Poulsen managed to make working devices and get them on sale. And that again back at exactly that same point of time. It's interesting to think if there'd been a Dragon's Den and the four of them had to come in and you sort of lined up Thomas and Edwin and Emil and Valdemar, who would have had the best pitch? Because history actually tells us it was Edison that got this all right, and he really didn't. The one that made the money, well, I say the one that made the money, Berliner got it right. But for the next 20 years, he and Edison spent most of their life in the courts fighting over patents. And Berliner actually made a very limited amount of money out of his invention. It turned out in the end that the Berlin Gramophone, the record as we know it today, was probably the winner. But the pianola gave it one hell of a run for its money. In 1900, the piano industry was the largest manufacturing employer in the United States. 1 in every 2 houses had a piano. We don't know how much they were played, but we know it was a major business. And the ability to go out and get something that would play it for you and play it at a volume that the whole family could hear was a very, very tempting one. And around this, we saw the birth of lots of new technologies. Now, Edison and Berliner were fighting this out. Everything here was mechanical, so we had enormous horns. People built horns up to 200 foot in diameter to try and play this in concert halls. They didn't work. But it was the birth of the sound engineer. Now, the interesting one for our friends up in the box, sound engineer's main job at that point was just making sure the right person stood in front of the microphone. So mixing was done by getting hold of somebody's shirt collar and pulling them out of the way and pushing the next person in. We had no means of recording. If something went wrong, you had to start again. But it's a profession that has advanced enormously. So what did the end project look like? This is Edison relaxing to one of his recordings. It didn't look like a great advert. Now, to be honest, Edison never thought that playing music was going to be the big market. Edison thought the big market was recording voice to improve business efficiency. As we'll later see, that turned into the dictaphone. The other market, he thought, was to make dolls that could record a child's voice and play it back. And he actually set up a business to do that. But he only managed to sell 500 of them before the business went bust. In contrast, the advert for the pianola is really quite tempting. Just lay back and listen to the music. They were immensely popular, but shortly after they came out, an interesting thing happened, which is that it changed from being advertised to women, and pianos had traditionally been advertised to women, to being advertised to men. And the assumption here was that once hubby had come home from a day's work at Making America Great for the first time, with no prior training, he could sit at the piano and play like a Beethoven or a Mozart. And we saw this carry on through most of the history of audio equipment. It started to be marketed to men. I put this in because I couldn't resist this. This is out of an advertising leaflet in Australia in the late, I think it was 1909, of just how far the pianola travelled. If you were in Australia, that's how you got your pianolas delivered. It's one of those few things, you see pictures and you think, I've got to use that somewhere. I'm going to make up a talk just so I can use that picture. Hopefully it's a bit better than that. But they're largely a forgotten industry. They were immensely successful. As I said, every other house had a piano in the States, and half of those by 1920 had a pianola in them. You could record off them in the round about 1920. You could actually play a piano and it would record it. And you then had the interesting one that there were orchestral concerts with no pianist. They had a pianola sitting on the stand with a conductor and a full orchestra playing somebody else's recording. And fascinating things happened. Ravel arranged Bolero for 2 pianos. Now, if you're arranging a piece for 2 pianists, you do it one of 2 ways. You either have them sort of sitting side by side, so one does the bass and one does the treble, or else you have 2 separate pianos. And if you've got 2 separate pianos, they can be playing sort of in the same region of the piano. In, I think it was 26, Ravel and one of his friends recorded this version of Bolero. And then the studio took those 2 recordings and combined them onto a single piano roll. So you had 4 hands playing on the same piano, but they could be playing sort of overlapped. And there are some fascinating things that were done. Stravinsky loved the pianola. He rearranged all of his works for the pianola. He even wrote a study for the pianola. And there's an Argentinian composer, Canlon Nancaro, who specifically writes for pianola by punching holes in that. And there's amazing things here where it sounds as if there are 100 keys going down at one time. So it is almost being used as an instrument. And if you look at the music instrument digital interface, the standard that's used for all electronic instruments today if you're recording music, called MIDI, they still call the composing screen of that the piano roll. So it's had a lot of influence. But then we had other things come along like motor cars and broadcast radio, and people just fell out of love a bit with the piano. And the industry, although still there, started to dwindle. But it was an incredibly successful way of reproducing music. In the meantime, the record industry was trying very hard to do something, and a company called Victrola, which still exists today, did something very interesting. They said, how can we try and make this louder for an average home? We haven't got amplification, we haven't got loudspeakers yet, which of course they couldn't say because they didn't know anything about loudspeakers. And their owner said, why don't we make a cabinet and we'll have a re-entrant horn? So they've got a record player in the top, and the sound goes down a pipe and then sort of spools round and comes out of a great big horn at the front. And the reproduction from these is really surprisingly good. It's got volume control in the form of a pair of doors. But they took the approach when everybody else was saying, can we make these things cheaper? Can we get it down to $20 or $15? They said, no, let's make this a piece of upmarket furniture and sell it for $200, equivalent of about $7,000 today. Most of the board said that's rubbish, we'll go bust. Within 3 months, they had sold out and were building their own furniture factory. In today's terms, if you look at their growth, we would call them a unicorn, a billion-dollar company. They weren't quite a unicorn because that's their trademark. We all know this picture. Some of us may or may not. It was painted by a British painter who painted just down the road by Hyde Park Corner. There's actually a blue plaque next to the RAF club, just behind the bus shelter on that side, to commemorate Francis Barrow. He painted this, but he painted it with Edison's machine on. He tried to get it hung in the RA. He'd exhibited there before, and they just said, no, that's commercial. So he went over to the Edison company and said, would you like to license this picture? And Edison said, that's stupid, dogs don't listen to phonograms. So he went to Berlin, I went to Victrola. Because of the patent legislation, Berliner had lost access to the American market. He'd licensed his machine to Victrola. And Victrola said, absolutely, we love that, but you've got to repaint it with one of our machines instead of Edison's. And that's how we got that. And they did remarkably well. And then the First World War came along, and they actually went off and converted the factory to making very early versions of drones, which I don't think ever flew. But they came back as Victrola, immensely successful. They were eventually bought by RCA. They are still here and making stuff today. And all because they took the risk of going up market when the rest of the market was going down market. If you listen to some of the recordings being played by the enthusiasts that have restored these machines, they really are surprisingly good quality. The biggest concern people had is that you only got 2 to 3 minutes on a record or on a cylinder. Records could improve. They increased the size. They eventually standardized on the 12-inch shellac records that we know from the old 78 days. That was in the 1920s. It wasn't until the 1920s they actually standardized the speed. And early record players had a mechanical handle that you turned around, and depending on who you bought the record from, you had to turn the handle at different speeds. It wasn't an industry that was good at standards. And then somebody very quickly thought, I know a way we can double the amount of music we put on a record. We put it on both sides instead of just one. That gave us the A side and the B side. It's been with us ever since. It's been a convention that has frustrated musicians who sometimes think we've got 2 good songs on this record. Why is it only ever called by one side? But it was there. We have that. Time for some audience participation in case anybody's dropping off. How many sides can you have on a record? 2. So each one has a spiral. There's no reason you can't put 2 spirals on one side. Now that, of course, means that each one only lasts half as long, and you get different music played depending on which groove your needle goes down. The best known example of that is Monty Python's, the album, I'm jumping ahead years now, the Matching Tie and Handkerchief, where they have a record which has 2 B-sides, and it's random. If any of you remember Mad magazine, if you're my age, I see the knowing nods around here. They launched one of those little floppy vinyls on the front of one issue, which had 12 tracks. But the one I really love is there was a phase in the 1950s for roulette records. This had 38 tracks on it, 1 for each number from 0 to 36, plus 00. And if you didn't have a roulette wheel, you just basically randomly put your needle down on the record and it would tell you which number you'd chosen. Fascinating things that have been done in audio. But let's go back to the real stuff. Audio amplification came out. People invented valves or tubes, if you're American. We had those in the early 10s, but we couldn't play anything with it. It was useful if you were doing radio broadcasts, and started to be used for recording records because you could use that to drive a little solenoid that would do the etching in the record. But it was still the one way. We had basic microphones. The microphone was effectively the same as Bell had invented for the telephone 50 years before. And we didn't have any way to make things louder. We had the First World War. We normally say wars are really good for technology. They didn't actually do much for audio technology. We had the first instance of encrypting audio. The Germans used the wire recorder of Poulsen, but ran it at high speed when they recorded it. Now, if anybody listened to that recording, you wouldn't make out what it was. But when it arrived at the submarines, they had the opposite recorders or players that played it at 1/10 of the speed, and that was intelligible. So the first issue of encryption in voice. But this, again, is one of these slides I have to put in. With the little sort of telephone speakers, somebody designed a cement horn that allegedly produced sound that would go 3 miles. This was 50 years before Glastonbury. And I just think it's a wonderful way of people coming up with ideas out of the time, and then you suddenly see a little bit later it comes back and it works. But the important thing came in 1925. 1st of April 1925, a patent was filed for the first loudspeaker. I wrote an article about this on the 1st of April this year, and almost everybody came back and said, that's a really good April Fool. It wasn't an April Fool. This was true. 1st of April 1925, Edward Wente in the States put in a patent for a loudspeaker as we know it. A couple of weeks later, and literally just a couple of weeks, on the 20th of April, at a competing company, Rice and Kellogg put in a similar patent. It actually got granted early, but I think that's down to the vagaries of the US Patent Office. And we had speakers that we would now recognize and which could amplify sound with the benefit of those audio amplifying valves we have. And it changed everything. This is a picture. It was taken in 1925. If you wanted to listen to the radio, and radio broadcasts had started happening, you would all cluster around the family speaker and listen to it. And things changed very rapidly. They changed intriguingly differently whether you were in the US or in Europe. And 1936, the Berlin Olympics, you can just see on this side here, the little things standing up with what looks like a couple of lampshades on them were outside speakers. Telefunken and Siemens between them provided sound that covered 100,000 people in the course of just 10 years. So things changed differently. America got very much driven by commercial radio. And commercial radio in the States was mostly playing records, so they were only interested in being able to transmit for a few minutes. They weren't interested in recording. In the UK, the BBC had a lot of interest in trying to record programs so that they could then transmit them to the Empire on shortwave. And they did a massive amount of work in looking at how you could record 30-minute segments. Also, whereas the US was very much concentrating on commercial songs and music, here and in Germany, the concentration was very much on let's do opera, let's do proper music. And of course, we had film. Now, we all know what the first film with voice was. If you define it as the first film with synchronized voice released by a Hollywood studio that could be played in more than one theatre at the same time and consisted of more than one reel, you might be right. There were hundreds of films with sound. Jazz Singer actually used a record. They started to produce 16-inch shellac records, which were an absolute nightmare because you picked them up and they cracked, but which could be synchronized with the film. We had a whole host of different patents coming out that put little strips down the side of the film. And those were two different forms. And once again, Edward Wente's name came up. The man who invented the loudspeaker invented a little rotating diaphragm that could be used with that. The issue with most of these is you needed to upgrade the projectors and the sound systems in all of the cinemas. So it took a surprising amount of time for these to actually get out into the real world. Hence the fact that The Jazz Singer got all the publicity, but there were plenty of other sound films that used integrated sound on the film prior to The Jazz Singer. Another interesting one, if you look at the picture of the projector up the top, you'll see the little light detector is set at the back of the camera. And because you're using light to pick up the sound, you want it to be away from the main bulb. But that does mean that that sound generation is almost a second later than the film going out. So you had to record these with sound being put onto the film 21 frames before the actual image was being projected, so that the voice was in synchronization with what was being said on the film. And that's been a problem ever since, of getting the latency right between video and audio. A little bit about what happened with recording. The US, it was all about dictaphones. These were wire dictaphones. Edison and others were desperately trying to tell everybody this is what your business should do. So husband went in, sort of sat in the management office. He dictated his little letter. The child came up, collected all. Child labour was a big thing here. So they got children to carry the wax cylinders down from the managers to the typing pool. Once they were typed, the child then scraped off the surface of the wax so you could do another recording on it. The issue is that all of the managers were really hoping that when they moved up the corporate chain, they'd get a secretary for themselves, who generally knew far more about the business and actually wrote the letters. But the second they did move up and get a secretary, they threw their dictaphones out. Thousands got sold to US government departments. It's very dubious how many of them ever got used. And here at the BBC, we were using wire recorders. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever taken one of these to pieces. You're engineers. Why haven't you taken one of these to pieces? The tape they used was very much the same size as the tape in there. A spool of it, which was about 3.5 miles long, would contain about half an hour of programming. And they weighed about 100 pounds. They were using these, really surprisingly good quality, to record whole programs and then transmit them out. The speed these ran at, they were in their own little concrete room and you didn't go into it, because if the tape broke, you would be mincemeat. And in fact, one of those, this is the Marconi version. The German one, the Blattnerphone one, came with its own built-in spot welder for trying to mend the tape. But in Germany, AEG and IG Farben were working on using paper backing for tape, putting ferrite on it, and then latterly using polyester tape. So we were seeing the beginning of the reel-to-reel tape recorder that we know today. Then we had the Second World War. Again, it didn't do very much for audio. We did some useful wireless stuff, but that didn't get used for another 50 years. But while we were out there, the first thing we did was we bombed all the pianola factories in Germany. And then they bombed all of ours, which really did wipe out the pianola industry. But one of the reasons for that is that the mechanisms in those pianos were being used for flight simulators to train pilots. So it's fascinating where technology goes. While we were busy out in the trenches, Hollywood was busy doing some interesting innovations. Most people say Fantasia was the first film recorded in stereo. It wasn't, for two reasons. One, The Wizard of Oz had done it a couple of years before. And the second one was that Fantasia wasn't recorded in stereo. Fantasia was recorded as 4 separate tracks in surround sound. It was only shown in that form in one theatre because it needed special projectors and special sound. For the general release, it was mixed down to mono. And it didn't get released to stereo, I think, until 1958. So lots and lots of good PR stories that have absolutely nothing to do with the reality of how audio was delivered. But one thing that came out of the Second World War is GCHQ, or GCHQ's predecessor, was surprised that they could hear German radio broadcasts of concerts at really high quality, but which were time-lapsed. So they were sent at slightly different times in different parts of Germany. because their view was that the quality that was being broadcast could only be achieved with a live performance. And what had happened through the war is that tape development that started in AEG had basically got to where we consider sort of tape recording to be a viable technology. This was one of the recorders. A group from the States, led by a sound engineer called Thomas Muller, was sent over to try and take any useful technology, sort of rockets, whatever, tape recorders back. And he took this back and was amazed at it. He happened to talk to Bing Crosby's sound engineer. Now, Bing Crosby at the time was absolutely fed up with the US TV system because he had to do, radio system, because he had to do live recordings all the time. And he didn't want them. He didn't want to have to be tied by the times, and he also wanted the ability to react to his audience. He was shown this and immediately invested in it and persuaded the networks to let him be the first person to record and then broadcast recordings. And that was the beginning of this industry. They also reinvented for the fourth time something called AC bias that anybody that's ever built a tape recorder knows about. The little bits on the tape that you magnetize backwards and forwards are a bit like me in the morning. They're sluggish. They don't like to sort of get up. So you need to give them quite a jolt. If you superimpose a sound on them that's higher than we can hear, then they're all excited anyway, and you get much, much better quality. And that was invented, I think, first of all about 1910. The US Army reinvented it during the First World War. The Japanese did it in the 30s. AEG did it in the 40s. The version Thomas Muller brought back didn't have it on, so it then got reinvented by Ampex in the late 40s. All exactly the same invention. All of them patented it independently, but none of the patent boards ever noticed that it had already been patented. But anyway, we finally got there and it worked. In the meantime, records were out there. We had stereo coming out, and stereo is quite interesting. It actually says the needle can now go in two different ways, orthogonal to each other. It moves up the sides of the track, and that gives a stereo. And if you've got an existing needle, you get a pretty good imitation of the sound in mono. So that hit us in the 50s, and that was getting towards the peak of what analog recording and analog technology would do. Interesting one, it wasn't the first approach. I talked about how many tracks can you have. One company came out with this in the 50s, and it basically they had a separate left and right track and two heads on the record deck. And they sold it as binaural, which it wasn't, which we'll come to later. And the real purists, this is a modern picture. I haven't found an original, although I know from magazine articles they existed. You put two separate tone arms and cartridges on your deck, one for mono and one for stereo. Or at least people persuaded them. These are probably the same people that buy $1,000 a meter speaker cables. So, who remembers these? I looked at this after I did it. It's an AC128, which I think was Mullard, and it's germanium, not silicon from memory. But they're transistors. Texas Instruments, well, a number of companies in the States invented transistors, but Texas Instruments got them right, took them around all of the recording companies in the States saying, why don't you use these? And they said, no, it'll sound awful. And Texas said, no, there's a big market for it, but nobody took it. So they built their own radio. That's the one up the top. It was called the Regency, 1953. It sounded awful. They thought there was an enormous market, and this was the middle of the Cold War, and they thought that every American would want one of these to put in their bunker so that they could hear the all clear once the bomb had hit. And that really was their business model. They said there's at least 20 million sales of these. They sold about 100,000 and gave up. But a little company in Japan called Sony came along and said, oh, we think we could make something out of it. They'd been to the States and they'd said, teenagers are out of the house the whole time. Why don't we give them something they can take with them? So the TR-55, transistor radio 1955, was born. And the industry said, this is rubbish. And they sold millions. because music was portable. And it's something that the industry finds it very difficult to understand, that the usage can sometimes be just as important as the quality of the music. And not much later, we had the compact cassette, initially developed for dictation, but then people decided it was good enough for music, and we had the Walkman. History or anecdote has it that this was designed by an engineer for one of the founders of Sony, who liked listening to opera when they were travelling on long-haul flights. Opera keeps on coming back. We don't know whether that's true or not, but it's there and it worked. And one interesting thing, on this very first model, there are 2 audio jacks in the top. So 2 people can listen to this at the same time. By the second product, that had disappeared, and we would have to wait until today to be able to share music. But the interesting thing that then happened is that people realized they could record. And the audio industry in the States went absolutely apeshit over this, and have been for most of the rest of that century. But one other interesting one, and an important name, Ray Dolby came along, because cassette tapes, because it was quite thin tape in terms of width and it didn't move very fast, you had quite a lot of hiss. And he developed a way to remove that hiss from compact cassettes. And we almost all remember Dolby B and C. And what it does is it says that when music's loud, you don't hear the hiss. When it's quiet, you hear it. But if you can amplify the original sound in the particular sort of hissy bands when you record it, and then step down the amplification for that same band when you replay it, it reduces the level of the hiss to the point that you can't hear it. And all of a sudden, compact cassettes began to sound almost as good as hi-fi, to the point that leading brands out there were selling products with 2 cassette mechanisms in them, one to play and one that could automatically record off it. The recording industry of America tried to shut them down. They eventually, in some markets, managed to put a tax on audio tapes, but it was the beginning of a losing battle. At which point we moved to the digital age, and I've got an apology here that the lovely thing about the analog stage is you've got lovely wood-polished cabinets, and it's all moving parts, and you can sort of understand how it works. And once you get into digital, it's all maths and protocols, and lots of acronyms and initialisms, which I'll try not to talk about, but although it's really exciting, it can be a bit more boring. Anyway, we have the sound. How do we make it digital? Well, effectively, that's our sound wave coming in. And if we go back to the Shannon's theories, if we take a sample of the amplitude of that wave, we can just store those values, and then we can recreate the shape of it by effectively feeding them back in, rounding it off, and generating that. And the more times we measure them, the sampling rate, and the more accurately we measure them, then the more the resulting sound at the end will be identical to what we put in. And we do that with devices that are called an analog to digital converter. This is electronic engineers not being very bright with their naming. And it takes the incoming wave, it converts it into ones and zeros, and then you feed it to a digital to analog converter, and that reconstitutes something that is close enough to the original that most people can't tell the difference. If it's done perfectly, it's exactly the same. The more times we sample it, the better it should get. From the point of view of human hearing, 16 bits is the industry norm. That equates to a sort of 16,000 different levels. If you think of your old hi-fi equipment, you have a knob marked from 1 to 10, unless you're a Spinal Tap fan, which only gives you 21 values. So we've got lots and lots of values here. Our hearing is logarithmic. How we translate that logarithmic value to that 0 to 10 on a dial has wasted more man-hours of time than anything. I've been in audio standards for some time, and the second that the word volume comes up, your brain just wants to turn off. And how a CD works. CDs were designed to be really cheap, so you have a yellow bit which is polycarbonate, and you impress on it a mould that has all of those little noughts and ones which are converted into bumps. They're called pits and troughs, although they're actually bumps. And then you have a laser diode. For years, everybody was wondering, what the hell do we do with these clever laser diodes we've developed? And then they suddenly said, oh, we can put them in CD players. That shines onto the pits and bumps, comes back down, it hits a beam splitter or a semi-silver mirror, which passes off the reflection to a photodiode, and that generates the noughts and ones again. This spins round very fast. It actually changes speed as you move towards the center because it wants to get a constant speed of noughts and ones out. That's actually one of the reasons that Edison didn't like a disc record is he realized that the speed would be different at the outside and the inside, which means the frequency response would be different. And he thought it would be a big enough difference to be noticeable. The reality was it wasn't. But he placed his bet on the wrong horse because of that. And inside that, we don't just have a string of noughts and ones, we put lots of other information in. So we have something called parity, or in more exotic things like wireless cyclic redundancy checks, which looks to see if there was an error in the data. And the error for a CD is probably just a piece of dust on it. Because if you can detect an error, then you can do something to fill it in. It's something that we call packet loss correction, where if you see a signal and you think that's a wrong piece of information, you can just repeat the previous one, which sounds better to the ear. And there's lots of clever techniques that go in. And it does mean that if you look at a CD, quite a lot of it is not actually used for audio storage. It's all the other error correction, the names of the tracks, telling you where each piece of information is, telling the little motor where it needs to go to make sure it follows the track. And I was fascinated researching this on the web. Almost every web page you look at on how a CD works is wrong. It ignores all of this. But one of the interesting ones that came along and which really pissed off the industry, or at least the recording industry, was MP3. MP3 came from some work called MPEG, stands for the Motion Picture Expert Group. There's a couple of groups out there. There's a Motion Picture Expert Group that does MPEG, basically for videos. There's the Joint Picture Expert Group that does ones for photographs. So that's where we get JPEGs and MPEGs from. There is not an audio expert group, largely because the recording industry was quite happy with the status quo and didn't want to go down the digital route. But MP3 came out of the work that was being done for how do you transmit videos, thinking of things such as our digital broadcasting, DVDs and everything else. And one layer of it is how do you compress music? And we use something that's called a psychoacoustic codec. Human beings, when we listen to things, there's lots of stuff that we don't actually hear, either because it's beyond frequency range or because it's softer than something that's loud, or it's just something which we probably wouldn't hear because of what's come before. And all of these codecs work by looking at how much they can take out of audio without us noticing the difference. And how well they work depends on just how efficiently you can do that. Now, a really good codec, people can't generally tell the difference between the codec and the original. When you put it back together, you sort of reverse the process. And I always think it's a little bit like sort of putting makeup on audio. You add bits in to try and make it sound as good, if not better. And a fair number of people think that the re-encoded is actually better than the original. But the result of this is you can reduce a file size by a factor of 10. And that gets really important.
Sitting in the morning at the diner on the corner. I am waiting at the counter for the man to pour the coffee. And he fills it only halfway. And before I even argue, he is looking out the window at somebody coming in.
The reason I played that is at this stage, before we were actually looking at AI to develop anything, all of this tweaking was done by hand. And the man that was leading the MPEG development, Karl-Heinz Brandenburg at the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, came across that particular track of music and thought that would be a good one to see how good our codec is. So he ran it through and had that oh shit moment. In the course of the next year, he listened to that track over 1,000 times, which is dedication to duty, tweaking it. And by the end of it, we had MP3 basically as we know it today. The thing with MP3 is because it's only 1/10 the size, it's now easy, even with the download speeds and old-fashioned modems of that date, for people to rip their DVDs, produce a little file, and share it with someone else. And just a few years later, we saw a whole range of devices that would do exactly that. Started off with Saihan over in Korea, produced the first MP3 player back in, I think, 97. Rio did the very well-known one a little bit later. And then a few years after that, the iPod came out. Not a lot of difference between them other than sort of the user interface. The iPod used a micro miniature hard drive that Apple had got sole access to at that time, but was really well designed. And this was when the industry really had issues. They tried to close everybody down that they could think of. And at the end of this, in the States, they even got down to suing individuals and trying to arrest people that they had discovered had downloaded an MP3 file from a honeypot site. It didn't really work. You were never going to catch the whole population. And eventually, it started to die out. What came next was Bluetooth. I spent a lot of my life involved with Bluetooth. And in the early 2000s, Bluetooth developed something called the Advanced Audio Distribution Profile, otherwise known as A2DP, which is another example of why you should never let engineers near marketing names. And that's been the basis of all of Bluetooth audio over the last 20 years. It's gone into headsets, it's gone into speakers, it's gone into soundbars, and it has sold millions of products. At the same time, we've had iPhones, we've had streaming, we've had Pandora, and we've changed the model that streaming services, particularly ones like Spotify and Apple, have done deals with the major record companies, so we're no longer chasing everybody about patent or copyright infringement. Spotify is still the biggest. The second biggest one is now Tencent. That's mainly serving the China market. Apple is in number 3 position. Throughout all of this talk, I haven't really talked much about the recording engineers or recording artists other than Liszt. And it's interesting that they've largely been left out of the whole process. This has been about somebody else using them as a commodity and selling them. But that is where we are, and largely the lawyers have moved sort of out of the picture. We have a working model where the streaming companies actually now are driving the market, and hardware companies are trying desperately to provide something that works with those. So hearables, I came up with the word hearables back in 2013, whereas I'd been working on wearable devices. I'd moved to sort of working with hearing aids. And it sort of stuck. But this was an amazing device that came out of a Kickstarter project in 2014. It was a stereo earbud, but they had put in everything else you could possibly think of. It would measure your blood pressure, it was oxygen, pulse oximetry, it had a little MP3 player built in. They actually shipped this, but it never really got traction. Now, the ear is an ideal place for biometrics. Wrist is awful. I mean, you wave your wrist around the whole time. Your ear is where the semicircular canals are. It's designed to be static. It's moist. It's got a quite thin layer. You don't have thick, horny skin to get down to work out things like blood pressure. We will see more and more sensors go in. But that product was just way ahead of anything anybody else has managed to do. And it's taken a long time to do what goes in these devices. I won't spend too long. This is sort of the background of what's in a hearing aid. You've got multiple microphones. Multiple microphones so that you can beamform to try and pick up the voices around you or the sound around you. You have support for telecoils if it's a hearing aid. And you sort of pull all of those together. You look at running different algorithms to cancel external noise. Battery technology in hearing aids is amazing. They last for days compared to earbuds. They typically have another radio in so the two left and right can communicate. Bluetooth runs at 2.4 gigahertz. That's the same as a microwave oven. Microwave ovens run at that because they heat water up. Your head is full of water, so Bluetooth doesn't go from your left ear to your right ear. So if you want to communicate, you need another one. But this is now all appearing in one tiny little chip in these. And of course, it came out in AirPods. And since then, the world has flocked to them. It is the fastest selling consumer product ever by a long way. What's really interesting is you can't buy, as far as I know, any single record that has been recorded for them. There is a difference between stereo, where you listen to two speakers that are out in front of you, and what you hear if you put something in your ear. For earbuds, we should really be recording with a microphone that looks like a head, and they exist. You basically have two microphones in the position of a dummy ear. And we just don't do it, and the industry doesn't do it. And they go on about how wonderful the quality is, and nobody's thought about the fact that we should have binaural. Apart from that very old-fashioned record player I showed that said it was binaural, when in fact that was stereo. Fascinating stuff coming out with these, though. Apple will let you record audiograms. You can basically do a hearing test with AirPods. They will tell you if you've got a hearing problem. Now, they're not brilliant for most hearing loss, but they will help you with slight hearing loss, and they will also tell you you ought to go and see an audiologist. If you haven't had a hearing test, please go and get a hearing test. Generally, it's reckoned that only about 10% of people who would benefit from a hearing aid wear one, and most people wait 10 years beyond the point they would be helped by a hearing aid. And it's frightening looking at the stats of just what happens. If you do want to wear earbuds or anything else and you're out, get ones with noise cancellation. If you can remove the external noise, it means you can reduce the volume, and that will help preserve your hearing. So, moving towards the end, over the last 10 years I've been working on Bluetooth low energy audio. That's just come out, and we tried to rewrite the book on audio, looking forward to what do we need to do. It's all the good things, but the important thing is that we can send left and right streams separately. You can't do that with existing earbuds. They actually send it to one ear and then they transfer the sound to the other ear. And in doing that, they add about 100 milliseconds of latency. We can now get that down to about 20 milliseconds. So if you're at about the fifth row back and you're wearing a new Bluetooth headset, you'll hear my voice at exactly the same time as you hear it through your Bluetooth earbuds. Our cameramen at the back will actually hear it through the Bluetooth earbuds before they hear me talk. But 10 milliseconds difference there, it's not going to be a problem. Means if you put this in the back of your TV, you don't have a lip sync issue. And the important one is a new part of the standard that we've called Auracast. Auracast is about sharing music. Most of this work grew out of hearing aid technology, which is actually way ahead of earbud and general audio technology. This lets us transmit multiple streams. I was recently at a trial over in New York in the Lincoln Center. We transmitted a stereo signal from the orchestra to the entire auditorium, which is 1,000 people, with a device that size. That will be on the market soon. It'll cost about 100 quid. You can plug it in the back of your TV. You can cover a theatre. And yesterday we heard that the first theatre in the world has just installed this, and that's the Everyman Theatre in Cheltenham. So thank you, Cheltenham. A few quick things on what it does. So the classic one is the TV. It's a general belief in the audiologist industry that what gets most people in having a hearing aid test is the fact that their partner has got fed up with them turning up the volume control on the TV, and has said, you either go and have a hearing test or else I'm getting a divorce. This allows you to just have the TV on at normal, and the person wearing hearing aids, and they can be earbuds, can adjust the volume to exactly what they want. They could also adjust it to an enhanced stream that has reduced the background music to make the speech more intelligible, so that they don't go on about everybody mumbling. You can send different languages. So if you want to listen in a different language, this is probably more of use in conferences and in cinemas, you can listen to different soundtracks. And if you're one of those people that think sports bars are a good idea, I've never understood why, if you have multiple TVs, you can just tune into whichever one you want. The way to do it is if you just get your phone, scan a little QR code next to the TV, and that will tell your earbuds, listen to that TV. The phone isn't actually involved in the audio at all in that. It's just there to direct your earbuds to what they need to do. And from my phone, I can just say, well, look, I've got a nice thing here. I'll share that. You can all listen to it. It's going to change the way we use sound. And I think there's some really exciting stuff about it. And what's coming next? Well, I mean, there's lots of things coming. We have better codecs. I personally don't think we'll be able to hear them, but the industry wants to go faster stripes. Spatial audio, where you can actually hear where the sound's coming from. That's a bit like what Dolby did with Atmos. I mean, Dolby has been promoting surround sound. Interesting fact there, I mean, I talked about Liszt and Ken Russell's Listomania. That was the first film to be recorded in Dolby surround sound. Strange synergies you see coming in. First film to be recorded in Dolby stereo was Clockwork Orange, which of course features a hooligan who loves Beethoven. And both were done by British studios, not by Hollywood, which probably tells you quite a lot about where technology gets picked up. Sorry?
At Brunel University.
Yeah. So what would you say? We'll see lots of things in hearables. We'll see health sensors. Battery boxes can have a lot more useful technology in. That's a pet subject. Maybe it's another talk. And one day we're going to get fed up of carrying bits of black glass around with us. And I think earbuds can do a lot they don't. So who invented sound? I mean, everything tells us it was Mr. Edison, but I'm not actually sure it was. Even Gershwin immortalized him. I think the real person we need to think is Edward Winter. He invented the loudspeaker. He was prominent in getting sound onto films. He invented condenser microphones. Almost everywhere you look at the audio technology, his name crops up, but nobody knows about him. And the other one is Ray Dolby, who spanned the period from analog through into digital, and they are still innovating and way ahead of most of the rest of the market. So I'd like to thank them. I'd like to thank you for listening. We're now into Q&A, and I'd like to ask an old colleague, Tim Whittaker. We first met in the theatre in Cambridge, where we were both fighting a reel-to-reel... Yes. I remember a reel-to-reel tape machine with a slipping clutch, which made sound cues very, very interesting. But anyway, Tim knows probably more about audio than I do, to be perfectly honest. Questions?
I think somebody will come and chase around with thank you very much indeed. Will I grab the other one, or I can yell?
That side, yeah. Oh,
So, yeah, first question, please.
Hello, thanks very much. Not actually a question, but I learned a short while ago that HMV with the dog listening to the loudspeaker was his master's voice, and he was sitting on the coffin and listening to his master speaking and couldn't understand how he could hear a dead body.
Well, I have to say, I don't think that's true, because this is another instance of a dead dog being used in audio. The dog was called Nipper. Francis Barrow's brother had the dog, but his brother had died, and he'd taken the dog on. The dog had died 3 years before he did the painting, and he did the painting from a photograph of the dog. Now, whether that's a true story or apocryphal, I don't know. But go down Piccadilly and look at the plaque and some of the information around that.
Your example
there.
is excellent of the mythology which pervades audio, I have
Yeah.
to say. Hi. Go ahead, please. Sorry, coming to you, I think. Sorry, well, just for the benefit of the
wartime encoding, I believe some of the spies actually had their messages written as musical scores. So the notes represented the letters.
Yep. I mean, codes, well, I say codes or ciphers, have gone back and used all sorts of things over the years. So yes, the good old encoding where you're simply swapping letters, we go from the early ciphers, but yes, there's lots of substitution into using different things for them.
Trouble is, one of the officers might have tried to play it.
It's the eternal cat and mouse game of it seems a really good idea and awfully secure until somebody works out how to crack it.
Can I?
Jonathan.
Please go ahead.
I don't know how true this is, that I seem to recall that in France, probably in the 50s, maybe 60s, experimented with using a sound as a way of exterminating people in villages. They actually built a village to experiment. I think it was 7 cycles per second, which causes the human body to organs to vibrate. Whether this is just science fiction or whether it actually happened, I've always wondered.
There is a real one facing across the Straits of Taiwan from China, which is apparently the world's largest siren. And a siren basically is a way of modulating sound onto a big air current and really providing some significant amplification. And it was thought that that was for actually causing physical damage.
I mean, sound has been developed by most countries' military as what they term a non-lethal weapon. For either crowd control or just to sort of, the non-lethal one is, it's like sort of use lasers to blind somebody, use high volume sound to deafen somebody. They then become less effective on the battlefield. So yeah, there's an awful lot of very dubious use of sound.
There's practical technology, anti-teenager, which is essentially using that bit between about 15K and 19K, which they can hear and old lags like me can't. And it works very well, but whether it's humane...
Can I ask you about binaural sound? That you mentioned that if you recorded inside someone's ear, or effectively inside an ear, that it would sound better when you play it back on these headphones. I'd always understood that the actual shape of your ear was quite important. I mean, if you do this, you just cup your ear, sound is very different, and that half of the way that you tell where the sound's coming from is that higher frequencies are reflected differently from bits of your ear, so you can. But it's quite individual, I would have thought, and I'm wondering if you put this binaural sound into everybody's ear, whether they go, "Ooh, that sounds a bit odd to me," because the higher frequencies come back slightly quicker with my shape of ear.
Yeah, it is very much an individual one, and so far there's not much that actually looks at the ear shape as well.
There's tolerable consistency, I think, between the people's pinner shapes. I mean, they're basically the same fundamental design, even if the dimensions are a little different. But the BBC has done any number of radio plays and so on where they've actually recorded binaurally and said, look, put earbuds or cans on and you know, for best experience. Sorry, Nick.
No, you've been doing some of this.
For those who are genuinely totally deaf, maybe damage to the auditory nerve, how much work has been done on direct connection to that, and how much of the audio tailoring that you're doing would help towards making that work better?
When you say totally deaf and the damage to the auditory nerve, are you looking at something that's beyond what can be done with a cochlear implant?
Yes.
I don't know the answer to that.
Sorry, I'm afraid I can't. I mean, it's being researched, and attempting to make a direct connection. But it's. I think some small amounts of intelligibility in research programs have been achieved, but it's the cochlear implant's quite well developed, of course. But going beyond that, no, it's hard. I'm sorry, we haven't got a good answer for you.
Hi. Do you have any views or experience on the benefit of modern hearing aids for the tinnitus sufferer?
Yes. What I would say, when I say do I have it, I worked for a consortium of hearing aid companies, that I still do, and tinnitus is a subject that keeps on coming up. All of them have different approaches to how they deal with tinnitus. And the comments I've always had coming back is, if you are suffering from tinnitus, go to an audiologist. Different brands approach it in different ways, and none of the manufacturers that I know that I talk to say ours is the best. They say, try them out, find out what works for you. I don't think any would claim they have a solution to it, but they all have algorithms that they believe will help particular individuals with their tinnitus.
It's interesting that they also all resort to cognitive behavioural therapy to help. And also there are now some multi-stimulus type things. There's something rather interesting at the University of Michigan, which has just been launched as a product. I can't remember what it's called, but is claimed to give more help than the basic hearing aid will give you. But the hearing aids invariably help, I think.
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of tinnitus that you've got. But one thing that I was told was that if the tinnitus is close to a single tone, then that usually correlates to a dip in your frequency response. And if the hearing aid can fill that gap, as it were, then the brain eventually gets used to that and reduces the tinnitus tone that you hear. Whether that's correct or not, I've got no idea, but
so
thank you for answering.
My personal frequency response is crap at 6 kilohertz or so, but I get tinnitus at 9.5. I'm enough of a geek to want to measure these things, and I've followed Nick's advice. I do need and use from time to time hearing aids, but so the research is very incomplete at the moment. I was born 10 years too early to really benefit from the research that will have happened.
Hello. You mentioned noise cancelling earbuds, and when you were talking about that, you suggested that would enable people to listen at lower volumes, and then you suggested, but I might have misunderstood, that you could actually get hearing damage from using earbuds. Can you fill us in on that area a little bit more?
The answer to that is nobody knows on hearing buds. We know that sound level and persistent sound level can damage hearing. And it's not a black and white one. Some people will listen to loud music all their lives and not have an issue. Others will get rapid hearing loss. Research, the Beeb has done a lot of research because they do tests for all of their sound engineers, and they've noticed over the years that hearing loss is becoming more and more prominent, even in youngsters that are going in for that. The World Health Organization has done similar research, and they reckon that there's around about 1 billion people under the age of 30 who are already on their way to hearing loss because of their listening habits. We don't know yet whether earbuds are going to help or not. The consensus is if you've got noise cancellation, then you're listening, it's as if you're listening in a quieter room. It allows you to turn the sound down. Whether people do, we don't know. There are regulations coming in, it's going to be a few years before they happen, that try to persuade earbuds to measure the actual sound pressure level in your ear, report that back to your phone or whatever device is the source to it, so that you can monitor what the level actually is within the ear and then advise. At the moment, all that happens is you get this message saying, do you want to bugger up your hearing? And everybody just says yes. We don't know the fact of having earbuds in for a long time, which occlude the ear, so we expect humidity to go up. And so when I say it should help, it's the old one of just, if you're hearing less, it's a bit like if you're eating less, it's likely to be better for your health.
Just one other question. I mean, when I'm out walking, if I'm wearing earbuds, I tend now to just wear one so that I can hear the traffic. And
yeah.
I would have thought that there's also an issue about whether you're aware of your surroundings.
There is, but then, I mean, you can cite Darwin on this, that if the ones that get run over might not perpetuate that. AI is already there. It's in a lot of hearing aids, which will look at your surroundings and try and cope with it. That's now being used to perceive your surroundings, and it will look at things like, is there traffic noise around? In the States, there's somebody who makes headsets that will try and pick up gunshots to warn you. So there is intelligence going into hearing devices in general to be aware of the surroundings and provide you with appropriate information. Now, that may just be adjusting the level of noise cancellation. You've got a feature in a lot of earbuds now called transparency, where you can mix in the outside noise with what you're listening to. And in some of them, you can also start to do filtering on that, so that you can say, I only want certain bits of noise. It may just want to hear the sort of the lower noise of cars coming towards you. That's going to happen, and you're going to get a lot more intelligence. At the moment, it's largely a sort of turn this feature on or off. It's becoming more graduated.
I think AI gives you that bit of fairy dust, because otherwise ambient noise cancellation and being aware of your surroundings are directly, militating objectives, and you can have one or you can have the other. AI might just give you, a nice way of being silent until it's important, like the truck's bearing down on you. Perhaps.
Fascinated by the discussion on hearing aids. I am totally deaf without my hearing aid, and my hearing aid is a Baha, bone-anchored hearing aid. So the sort of improvements you've been talking about, would they be not applicable to a Baha, because it goes in through the skull, which surely must have a sort of natural frequency and mechanical filtering effect?
You can correct for that, of course, if you know that you have to do it. And there are regular headphones now which are bone conduction. They fit just behind the ear. And with modern DSP, it's easy within the battery power constraints and that kind of thing to correct for that. So hopefully your next Baha hearing aids will be Auracast compatible, and you'll be able to listen to everything that Nick listens to.
And we're also seeing the bone-based and bone conduction being used as another microphone, because when you're talking, you can use that to get better knowledge of the fact that what is being picked up by the other microphones is actually what you're saying.
Okay. One more here.
I was fascinated to see your photographs of the early transistor radios, and brought me back to my days as a teenager delivering newspapers on a paper round and listening to Tony Blackburn. You're right, the sound quality was awful, and I put that down to it being a tiny loudspeaker. Yeah. However, we now have these, which are orders of magnitude better and much smaller, and of course your earbuds as well. Can you say something about the changes in loudspeaker technology that have enabled that? And why is this so much better than the 2-inch loudspeaker that was in the transistor radio?
Can-
I mean, it's so much smaller.
Before you do speakers, let me just say 200 MIPS of DSP helps a lot. But Nick.
So, speaker improvement, there's been a lot that is, pardon me, purely mechanics on that and materials. One of the big ones is you're pushing air backwards and forwards. And the more rigid the diaphragm is, the better that's going to be. So a lot of the material science going in has been making the diaphragm as rigid as possible. But the more that gets rigid, the more resistance there is to movement. And that means we've needed much stronger magnets. So at the same time as we've got more rigid material for the diaphragm, we've been developing things like the neodymium-based magnets that are orders of magnitude stronger. Those have come together. There's not that much change in terms of some of that technology. Now, if you move to earbuds and hearing aids, we're looking at some balanced armatures, some very clever microminiature technology, which has also helped with that, plus the fact we're often putting in multiple speaker elements. So a bit like your old sort of room speaker with the treble, the tweeter, the main speaker and the woofer. The latest one is speakers that are produced purely out of silicon, where you're micro-machining little vibrating elements into a silicon wafer. Those are called MEMS speakers, for micro-engineered mechanical silicon. They are just about to appear in headsets. I think the first ones will be on the market in the next 2 to 3 months. And they provide a really incredible sound in something that is quite unbelievably small. But a lot of this has just been incremental development, particularly from the point that the first phones came out and then we started to put sound onto phones. You just see, if you're out there talking to the companies that make these, of each one will improve it by another 2 or 3% this time. But when you're revving that every year, that 2 to 3% each year, suddenly looking back seems like an absolutely incredible increase in performance.
Just wonder what your thoughts were, Nick, on electrostatic transducers. Talked about capacitor mics already, and they were an amazing leap forward from what was before. And of course, we do have loudspeakers and cans.
It's strange you should mention that, because the patent for those was also filed by Edward Wenty.
I suppose that's logical.
He's everywhere. I mean, I remember in the 70s, electrostatic speakers were the thing. Everybody wanted them. They are still out there. They're still being made. But in general, the industry hasn't gone down that route. And I think it's because more effort's gone into speaker technology design that has sort of bypassed the elements. If everybody had latched onto electrostatic speakers at that point, I suspect we'd have seen a lot more development in them than we have today. But the other issue with electrostatic speakers is, I mean, you can reduce them in size. There are electrostatic headphones. But if you then say, can I shrink it down and put it in an earbud? I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I want that voltage in my ear.
I don't know whether there's any electret equivalent for that size.
No, I mean, it's a bit like sort of combining ECD with your earbuds.
Yes. Any other questions? Over here.
So we have earplugs and we have hearing aids. Why have we got 2 technologies? Why can't they all be combined into one?
In time, I think they will be. What intrigued me when I started working for hearing aid companies is how much more advanced the technology was in a hearing aid combined to what was in a consumer electronics product. Now, at the time, that was headphones because they hadn't got on to doing earbuds. But even today, if you look at earbuds, the technology is still catching up on hearing aids. I think we will get there. It's interesting. Hearing aid companies generally design products for people with the most severe hearing loss. It's the sort of the top 10% of what can be treated. We're seeing companies like Apple coming in and looking at people with about the 10% least amount of hearing loss. Over time, I would expect those markets to coalesce. But once you get to the point of hearing loss that you really ought to be talking to an audiologist at some point, the consumer electronics companies aren't interested. That's not their business model. So I think we need to see the hearing aid industry move down to cover a broader swathe of hearing loss. And I suspect that will come. There's an initiative in the States called over-the-counter hearing aids, or OTC, which are hearing aids which can be sold without you needing a prescription for them. And those are catering with people with medium hearing loss. Most of those are being made by hearing aid companies. Now, some of the consumer electronics, Sony and Bose, both initially got into that market and then pulled back out. And again, this is all about ongoing support, which most hearing aid users like to have. But I think we'll see those merge. But the other one with hearing aids are ratified medical products. And that means you have got one hell of a lot of regulatory hoops to jump through. Over time, I do think we'll see that merge. But because it's coming from a medical product base, it'll probably take 10 years.
One over here, please.
Can I just ask you a little bit about TV sound? You don't seem to have said much about TV sound. My experience is that if I listen to a good quality radio, I have no trouble listening to kind of speech or something, but TV sound generally can be pretty awful, and they're well-known examples of this. And it does make you wonder what on earth's going on there, whether it's because the sound recordists are listening on headphones and they know the scripts and everything, and they don't sort of let a normal quotes person listen to the playback or what. I don't know, but I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Do you notice any difference between made-for-TV as against feature films and so on?
Yeah, I mean, feature films can be, pretty horrendous. And again, I don't know quite why that is, because I think there's, amongst actors, I think there's a certain kind of trait where, actors kind of mumble to character or whatever. But it's quite difficult because I need to have a hearing test. I know I need to have a hearing test because I'm sure my hearing is not what it was. But it's quite difficult to make out what's going on. And of course, on the average television as well now, on the average flat screen, you get about 4 different audio options. So you can have clear voice or film sound or this and that, which I suspect just confuses everybody to heck.
And if they're in the TV itself, they're rubbish little speakers anyway, which doesn't help you much. So soundbar is your friend, probably.
Yes, exactly. But I just wondered if you had something to say generally about, TV sound.
Well, it's an interesting statistic that apparently 75% of Netflix users turn the subtitles on. And the reason they do that is because the stuff is mixed for cinema, where your tolerance of a huge dynamic range is much higher. Apart from anything else, you haven't got a baby sleeping upstairs who will be woken up in the earthquake scene and so on. And you end up having to turn it down to deal with that, or loud music, same. But then the dialogue's far too quiet. And there are 1 or 2 companies moving into the space of using AI basically to unmix and remix for the home application, which is quite an interesting market. But yeah, I fear that there are different objectives out there. Why made for TV should be bad, I think, must be down to simple incompetence, because they have only one job to do.
I mean, sadly, there is a history of incompetence amongst recording engineers. I mean, present company, I'm sure it's evident. In the early days of the CD, all of the press coverage was about how awful the sound quality was, that it was tinny. It turned out that what was happening, sound engineers had always boosted higher frequencies on recordings because the cartridges for a record were poor at high frequency. There's something called the RIAA equalization. They didn't realize they had to remove that when they were recording CDs. So CDs had awful publicity in the first few years, purely because the masters were recorded incorrectly. And I think there is quite a lot of that goes on. People really ought to be going back and saying, we need these things to be audible. And organisations, I know the RNID complain about this. Film tracks now, quite a lot of film tracks will have a compatibility track, which should have better dialogue quality and reduced background quality. Amazon Prime do their dialogue boost, although I think that's an AI one that's actually trying to remix a signal rather than mixing it properly to begin with. But audiences don't seem to be going and not kicking the doors down, saying you're producing rubbish.
Well,
and if you look at this...
There have been one or two classic examples of TV programmes. I think it was, what was it? Jamaica Inn.
Yep.
There was huge outcry over that, and I think there have been one or two others since, but then it seems to have kind of, I don't know, died down.
Yeah.
That was a mumbling actor syndrome in particular, wasn't it? That one, I remember it.
It's interesting if you look at the specs for TVs, the audio spec is generally poor in terms of anything else you would expect to buy these days. And TV technology is not that great. When you go and work and talk to some of these companies and you look at the resources going into a TV as opposed to an earbud, they're not necessarily sort of at the top of the range in terms of the engineering expertise.
Yeah. Except that every TV in the world now has an SPDIF output, which means you can have a 48 kilohertz sampled linear audio coming out of it. So that ought to be as good as it gets.
Although it's transcoding from 44.1K coming in.
Or depending, yes, I get that. But that's that's a very second order audible effect compared with this poor dialogue recording kind of thing.
I'm sure you're right though that the sort of the leading or bleeding edge or whatever is in hearables and hearing aids rather than anything else. I can see that's I'm sure the case.
And it's been fascinating with Auracast because we're pushing this out into all sorts of other industries, is looking at the level of technical, not just technical competence, because these people have competent engineers, but their ability to think outside the box of what they've always done. And sort of when you say you can do this in different ways, you can have multiple soundtracks, and you just see sort of the blank expression come down of why would we do that? And it's all about the fact that's not what they've been doing for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Maybe as well you need to go and start kicking drama schools. Write a letter to the stage. That'll.
Can we perhaps thank our presenter in the normal way?
Thank you. Thank you. And I should say we have another lecture, as we do, on the last Friday of next month. It sounds a fascinating one. It's a company that's talking about the way they use AI in terms of telephone transcription in order to look at how do you take phone calls and build them into company records. What's interesting is one of the training sets they've had for doing that are the phone calls from Enron. So, amongst other things, they should be talking about how much people might have been able to find out about what was incipiently going wrong at the time if they had been able to take note of what was being said as well as what was just being put in emails. But that's on the web. Please sign up. Thank you so much for coming. If any of you have any thoughts of things you would like to hear about, or if any of you want to stand up here where I am and try and do the same thing, please come and see myself or John. Roger's not with us today, but just mail any of us. We want these lectures to be things you really enjoy, so your input's really valuable to us. But thank you for coming. Glad you enjoyed it. Thanks.
just